morning. In my presentation, I will show you some unpublished Christian inscription from Aquileia, which I have had the opportunity to study during my doctoral research, in which, for various reasons, present some aspects of interest. Some of them allow us to study deeper. Some of the themes we discussed yesterday in the Cristiana Museum or with Professor Mazzoleni. Some allow us to develop new themes, and others show us the potentiality and the problems that characterize fragmentary inscription. Okay. Before moving on to the year of the lecture, a few small clarifications. So yesterday morning, we have the opportunity to examine of the inscription preserved in Cristiana Museum. The museum currently houses about 150 epigraphs, but the Christian epigraphic heritage of Aquileia is much larger. In fact, it has 1,021 late antique and Christian funerary inscriptions, which makes Aquileia the third center in terms of number of documents after Rome and Syracuse, and one of the main ones in the western part of the empire. I will often talk to you about late antique and Christian inscription, because of these 1,021 inscriptions, 580 are certainly Christians, while 441 are certainly late antique, but do not show clear traces of Christianity. In the vast majority of cases, this is probably due to their fragmentary, even very fragmentary state. But there is also a small percentage of documents between 22 and 26 that are actually characterized by a neutral formula and that therefore would really belong to non-Christian. I will talk to you about funerary inscriptions, which comes from the Christian cemetery areas which arose around the city walls of the late antique period. These cemeteries were often developed in relation to basilicas, but not always. Generally, they are located near the walls, with the exception of the ones of the Belligna region, a large area between Aquileia and Grado, where there must have been at least 2 main cemetery nuclei associated with basilicas. These are subdivo cemeteries, and this has meant that their conservation had been greatly compromised. We know them rather poorly. They have been even damaged by post-ancient interventions and by 18th and 19th century excavation. And also for this reason, several of the inscriptions we will discuss are in an extremely fragmented state of conservation. Furthermore, like many of the Aquileian epitaphs, these inscriptions are almost never associated with a specific tomb. First, we can examine the inscription of Discolius or Discolia. As you can see, this is a rather fragmentary inscription. Originally, it reported the biometric data and the dies natalis, the day of death of the commemorated person, but they are almost completely lost. However, what interests us the most is the deceased name that we recognize on line 2, Discoli. It can be easily integrated as Discolius or Discolia, declined in nominative form or more probably in the dative form. And this is a name of Greek origin attested from the 3rd century onwards, especially in Rome, particularly in Christian inscription. It alludes to a person of a surly and intractable character, and therefore this is an example of the so-called name of humility. As we have said briefly yesterday, these names are characterized by a negative meaning linked to wishes, with bad character traits, or with animals considered symbols of inferior qualities. According to the traditional interpretations, these names descend from the insults addressed to the Christian and at the times of persecution. At first, they would have been accepted by the faithful with the resignation to suffer in the name of the Lord, and later they would have become almost titles of glory and of modesty and humility that lasted a lifetime. However, Father Ferrua, and especially Cayanto, have stressed that they are not a Christian invention, but they are also pagan. There are also pagan examples of these names. In particular, Cayanto believes that they are uncomplimentary cognomina, similar to those of the Republican era, like Brutus, probably originated from individual nicknames that ridiculed physical and moral imperfections or socially inappropriate behaviors. After having captured the popular imagination, these anthroponyms would have become common cognomina, passed down from parents to their children without paying attention to their original meaning. According to the scholar, the high frequency with which they occur among Christians can be as easily explained with a chronological argument. Their endings, their suffix, are late. They are late name coined not earlier than the beginning of the 3rd century and became truly frequent only from the beginning of the 4th century, when Christian documents were prevalent. In the end, they would have been only a phenomenon linked to local customs and personal tastes. In any case, they have a very limited impact on the panorama of Christian names, because they are very rare, and also in Aquileia they are rare. Out of 569 anthroponymies, referring both to the deceased and to the dedicators of the epitaphs, we have only 8 names of filiation, equal to 1.4% of the total. The next inscription comes from the Marignane, an area in the western part of Aquileia, where in late antiquity there was a villa that whose structures are being reused for funerary purposes. The inscription commemorated a daughter whose name can certainly be integrated as Constantia. It reported her biometric data, and unless here at the end of the line 3 there is some other characters, we can be almost certain that she died at the age of 10 years and 5 months. What interests us, however, is the presence of the incipit formula dis manibus. This expression is attested in a Christian inscription from various centers of the Orbis Christianus Antiquus. In Aquileia, it appears on 25 late epitaphs, alone or sometimes accompanied by a Christogram. For a long time, its presence on the inscription of the Christians has attracted the attention of scholars who try to explain its meaning on this monument. Initially, it was interpreted as the abbreviation of Deo Magno. By now, however, it is accepted that the late antique stonecutters were aware of its original pagan, or better, non-Christian meaning, but that they still made a conscious use of it. At the same time, certainly, it no longer had its ancient value. According to Professor Mazzoleni, probably the expression dis manibus had by now lost its sacred meaning of dedication to the protective deities of the tomb. Instead, it had accentuated the meaning of indicator of a locus religiosus, or a res sacra, of a tomb protected by law, whose its inviolability recalled. This interpretation is accepted by Professoressa Fulvia Mainardis of Trieste University, who also proposes some further reflections with respect to the Aquileian documents. Since the presence of the abbreviation dis manibus can be traced back to a preference of the dedicators of the epitaphs or of the deceased itself, the scholar wonders whether the choice of its apposition could have been influenced by the context of the original use of inscription. She observes, in fact, how several epitaphs characterized by this title come from the Marignane area. In the early and middle imperial period, this region was characterized by a strong funerary vocation. Probably this vocation also remained in late antique times, since the area has returned several Christian inscriptions, despite not being interested by the foundation of a Christian basilica. Mainardis, therefore, hypothesizes that this funerary area was not configured as a collective cemetery of a Christian nature, but as a public burial ground still essentially pagan, in which the dis manibus could function at the same time both as an element of continuity and as a guarantee of sacredness and untouchability of the burials, relegating its religious values to the background. I find that this is a very interesting point of view. Indeed, if we take into consideration the Aquileian inscription with this formula, we see that most of them are of unknown provenance, but that after them, the greatest number of epitaphs with the dis manibus come from the Marignane. Here, in fact, 7 late antique epitaphs with this expression have been found, which correspond to over the 10%, almost 11% of the total late antique inscription discovered in this region. With regard to the characteristic of the funerary occupation of the area, however, the data currently enables suggest caution. On the one hand, in fact, the distribution of the epigraph in the area seems to indicate that at that time could have been several burial grounds in Marignane. On the other hand, on the basis of the inscription alone, it is very difficult to evaluate the existence and consistencies of a possible presence of pagan tombs. In fact, for this period, the region has returned 47 Christian inscriptions, 16 fragmentary inscriptions that do not allow us to say anything about the religion of the deceased to whom they belong, and only 2 complete inscriptions characterized by a neutral formula, which could actually belong to a non-Christian. And in both of them, the formula dis manibus is missing. Furthermore, if we consider the late antique inscription with the dis manibus as a rule, we can see that most of them are certainly Christian epitaph, while only a few of them could actually belong to a non-Christian. In any case, it's clear that in Marignane there is a particular concentration of this formula, and it can be thought that it falls within the epigraphic habit of this region. What caused the use of this expression to spread here? It is possible that an environmental factor caused the need to protect the tombstone by underlying the inviolability and sacredness to be felt more strongly in this area, while in other areas, perhaps this effect was guaranteed or favored by the proximity to a basilica. Furthermore, a continuity with the pre-Christian Roman epigraph tradition cannot be excluded, perhaps influenced by the epigraphic landscape of the area. However, our knowledge of the articulation of the late antique burial grounds of Marignane and their relationship with the older ones is still too fragmentary to reconstruct a precise pictures of their reciprocal relations. The next epitaph also comes from the Marignane. It's a very fragmentary inscription, only partially understandable and integrable. The only fairly central fact, certain fact, is that it commemorates a soldier or a relative of a soldier, perhaps a son or a brother. In fact, in lines 4 and 5, we see the sentence ex numero minorum, and we can think of a reference to a military unit. I don't know which unit. If you have any suggestion, it's welcome. Despite this fragmentary nature, I decided to propose this inscription to you above all for its symbolic decorative apparatus and because it allows us to address the theme of the lapidary workshops in late antique Aquileia. The late antique period is a period generally characterized by a certain decline in the technique of stone cutters and in which an increasing number of extra officinal production can be found. Alongside this, however, various testimonies from Aquileia show how a production of wood or quite wood quality continued to exist, probably connected to lapidary workshops that still worked in the trail of previous tradition, using their own models and cartoons. In the case of this inscription, it can be observed how it presents affinities in the paleographic characteristics and in the symbolic decorative apparatus with the 4 other epigraphs from Aquileia, 3 exhibited in Christian Museum and 1 preserved in another Italian city of northern Italy. Such similarity leads to hypothesize that these inscriptions are the product, if not of the same stone cutter, of the same workshop. In all 5 cases, the material are rather incomplete, so only a few observations can be made on the formulas of the expression typical of this possible lapidary workshop. For example, the Vixit instead of Vixit, or the fact that the numeral of the date of death is written in full and not as numbers. With regard to the paleographic aspects, it can be noted how the letters are always traced with a rather thin but well engraved traits, and how they present recurring layouts. To give just a few examples, in the case of the S, we can note as the upper semicircle is slightly set back from the lower one, and how the letter presents somewhat rigid traits. Or in the case of the T, we can observe that the arm of the letter, it can be found at the same time in a wavy form and horizontal. Likewise, the symbolic decorative apparatus of the inscription also presents important analogies. In all of the epigraphy, the deceased is represented as an orange. Generally, they are depicted inside an architectural structure supported by columns, smooth or twisted, with Corinthian capitals with the 2 orders of leaves. These type of structures allude to the paradise as Palatium and Civitas Dei. Sometimes this portal is surmounted by an arch, while in other cases it is surmounted by a vegetal festoon arranged in an arch with a gem in the center. Sometimes the praying figures are flanked by candelabra, and they are depicted on a 3-step suppedaneum. In the case of the soldier inscription, and in these ones, some of the characters are depicted holding in their hands a closed volumen, a symbol of wisdom and of the Holy Scriptures. The scroll is a very rare theme in early Christian images of Aquileia, and significantly, it seemed to appear only in these 2 inscriptions. Where the upper part of the slab has been preserved, it can be seen as a large Constantinian monogram traced above the head of the deceased. And finally, in these two slabs, we can note as the female figures present a very similar clothes and a very similar hairstyle. The next epigraph commemorates a deceased named Posidonia. She therefore bears a mythological name, but now certainly deprived of its original meaning. and reminded as a matter of fashion and personal taste. However, in this case, the most interesting aspect of this document is its symbolic decorative apparatus. Contrary to what we see in other Aquileian inscriptions, in fact, here the image is not scratched, but seems to be a true example of microsculpture. The stone cutter indeed lowered the surrounding surface so that the figurative motifs emerged as a writer-marked relief. And as far as I know, this is the only example of this technique in the Christian inscription of the city. The symbolic decorative apparatus occupied most of the space of the slab. Now only a small portion of it is preserved, but sufficient to understand that originally it represented an oran figure, inserted in a paradisiacal setting intended as a locus amenus and characterized by the presence of doves, priests, or wishes. Under the epitaph, indeed, we see an open hand facing upwards and a small bird, probably a dove, among some leaves. Moreover, to the right of the text, part of the lower surface remains, and in this point, it is characterized by a curvilinear trend. Undoubtedly, this sector coincided with the original central part of the slab and hosted the representation of the face of the aura. In the case of the next epitaph, we can see how the text of the inscription has been lost, and it is preserved only the part of the symbolic decorative apparatus. In the center, we see part of the lemniscate breadth. Inside that, some traits are most likely the remains of a Constantinian monogram. On its left, we see a female figure in the attitude of an orant, and originally probably another orant was represented in a symmetrical position to the right to the breadth. The most interesting aspect of this document is that it is engraved on a tile reused for funerary purposes, and it is well engraved. Indeed, it is worth highlighting the contrast between the good quality of execution of the figurative apparatus, in particular the breadth, whose leaves are not scratched but emerge from the terracotta, and the modesty of the support on which it is made. Funerary inscriptions on Opus Latericium have been known for a long time and are not a novelty peculiar to Christians. In fact, examples of them can be found as early as the 4th, 3rd century before Christ, and then again in imperial and late imperial times. They are not, Christian inscriptions on tiles and brick are not very numerous, as they are less resistant materials than stones, but we know various attestations mainly from central Italy, dating between 3rd and 5th, 5th century. In Aquileia, starting from the 9th century, 6 or 7 funerary inscriptions on Opus Latericium have been found. And recently, some of them have been studied by Professoressa Mainardis and by Dottoressa Susanna Sgoifo. These scholars observed how these inscriptions generally appear in a good state of conservation, as if they had not been subjected to the action of atmospheric agents. They therefore hypothesize that the tombs indicated by these markers were not used in sub vivo cemeteries, but inside basilicas or in underground structures. Furthermore, at least for some of them, including this one, which is rather small, they think that they could have been placed on the short side of Pupa tombs. Unfortunately, however, as I said at the beginning, almost none of the Christian inscriptions for Aquileia have been found associated with the tomb, and therefore, even in this case, we are not certain of how this material were originally displayed. Also, in this case, what interests us most is the symbolic decorative apparatus of the inscription. The text indeed is very fragmentary, only a few letters survive and they do not form a word with a complete meaning. In the image, instead, we can distinguish the upper part of a charioteer, depicted in profile and facing left. The head seems protected by an helmet, while the body is wrapped in a long sleeve tunic and in a cloak attached to the right shoulder. One arm is raised, perhaps originally captured in the act of gripping the whip, while the other is stretched backwards, perhaps tighten the reins. Below him, two carved lines, very close together and parallel to each other, could be what reminds of a chariot wheel, while in front of him, the rear part of a horse can be distinguished. It is possible that this image is connected to the profession practiced by the deceased during his lifetimes. And this will be very interesting for two reasons. First, the Christian inscription of Aquileia reported very few attestations of professions. Secondly, the deceased would have been a professional circus performer, a charioteer. If so, this document would be added to that of the agitator Urbicus, called the Romulus, which we see yesterday, whose Christianity is matter of a discussion among the scholars. These presence in late antique Aquileia are very interesting. Indeed, the father of the church condemned this type of profession and the world of entertainment in general, because in their opinion, superstition and idolatry reigned in the world of games, and such activities incited the human soul to disputes and debauchery. Despite this, literary source and especially epigraphic sources show how historical reality was more complex and how these professions were not always and not everywhere forbidden to Christians, as long as they were practiced without offending the principles of morality and in a non-bloody way. Indeed, the inscription attests the presence among the faithful of acrobats, pantomimes, mimes, gymnasts, choir masters, gladiator masters, and charioteers. For now, apart from the Aquileian documents, the latter are attested only by a few Roman epigraphs. From the inscription we have seen so far, you have surely realized the great fragmentation of a significant part of the epigraphic heritage of Aquileia. This applies both to the inscription preserved in the deposit of the Archeological Museum of Aquileia and to those preserved in other locations, first of all Trieste, where the fragments are inserted in the surrounding wall of the lapidary garden of the Civic Museum. Despite this fragmentation, some pieces, like those we have just seen, present peculiarities and aspects of interest in themselves. Others, however, need to be compared with others to other materials to fully reveal their potential. Therefore, in the course of my research, I have compared many fragments, some of which have already been published and known for some time. In this way, I could reunite some pieces never before attributed to the same document. In the most fortunate case, it was possible to partially recompose some inscription, clarify their content, enhance fragments that would otherwise be somewhat overlooked, and possibly confirm the actual belonging to Christian epigraphs. Sometimes it has been possible to reconstruct an inscription almost entirely. In this case, this epitaph is composed of various fragments preserved in Trieste and one kept here in Aquileia. Thanks to these reunions, we can understand that it was dedicated to a little girl who died at just over 4 years old and as neophyte, that's it, newly baptized. Probably her parents had understood that she would not survive and had her baptized shortly before that to allow her to go to heaven. The only doubts that we cannot resolve due to remaining gaps concern the exact days lived by the little girl and her name in this part of the inscription. Based on the remaining letter and the gable space, the latter could have been either Bonifazia, a Jewish name widespread in the Christian world, especially in Rome and in Africa, but attested only once in Aquileia, or Bonipedia, a name known only from another Aquileian inscription. Another epitaph for which it was possible to find attachment with a fragment of Trieste is that of Valentiniana. The most interesting aspect of this inscription is linked to the mention of the duration of the deceased wedding. This in fact lasted only 28 days. And perhaps this circumstance can be linked to another singular aspect of this epitaph, which, although belonging to a married woman, was commissioned by her parents, apparently without involving her husband. The same situation can also be observed in other Christian inscriptions from Aquileia and Rome. And this strange absence could depend on the previous death of the husband, but in all of these documents, there are clear clues that support this possibility. Perhaps, therefore, it must be admitted that sometimes the bonds between daughter and parents prevail over those between husband and wife, especially in the presence of young wives and, as in the case of Valentiniana, recently married. Alongside these more fortunate examples that we have just seen, there are some reunions that have given rise to inscriptions that are still very incomplete, only partially understandable, and that, although certainly late antique, do not bear clear signs of Christianity. These pieces fall within that 94% of fragmentary inscription without a trace of adherence to Christianity that I show you in one of the first slides. However, they are interesting materials that it seems appropriate to keep simply appropriate to keep them in mind. In fact, very often they are composed of fragments discovered many years apart from each other. And it is possible that in the future, even new attacks will be found, clarifying their meanings and the fate of the deceased. An example of this situation is given by the two inscriptions that I show you here. The first on the left is composed of 3 fragments. The lower one was discovered in Beligna in 1899, while the upper ones were discovered in the same region in the 1970s. And from what remains, it's possible to understand that the epigraph was dedicated by parents to a son, perhaps called Eutychius. The second inscription on the right was composed also by 3 fragments. The one on the left was discovered in Beligna in 1900, while I wasn't able to find information about the other 2, but they were with the other materials found in the 1970s. It was dedicated to a woman called Flavia and addressed like Domina, in this case used as a title of respect, and probably Coniugi Pientissime. A last fragmentary inscription that is rather problematic and interesting is represented by these 3 fragments. Probably in this state of conservation, it shows no clear traces of Christianity. It commemorates a man. Originally, it reported his biometric data, the length of his marriage, and the day of his death, but all this information are preserved only partially. But the most interesting and problematic aspect of the inscription its provenance, the provenance of the fragment that compose it. In fact, fragment, I call this fragment for convenience A, B, and C. In fact, fragment C and fragment A, were discovered in Beligna, respectively in 1900 and in 1939. Here you can see the state of conservation of the fragment A at the moment of the discoveries, and it is now. Fragment B, on the other end, was discovered in 1993, not in Beligna, but in Grado. It was found during the investigation carried out in the area of the old Hotel Fonzari, during and after the removal of the hotel foundation. On the same occasion, in the same place, other fragmentary Christian funerary inscriptions were also found. This fragment have been found near some tombs, but in mixed layers, so it was not possible to associate them with a specific tomb. It was believed, however, that they belonged to the cemetery area that developed around the so-called early Christian basilica in Piazza della Corte, that it's here, and that it's very, very near to Hotel Fonzari. This area, it's so important to think that that had already returned other funerary evidence, surely linked with the basilica. So the reunion and association of fragment B with the two pieces that certainly came from the Beligna area comes unexpectedly and present us with a rather problematic situation. In fact, the problem arises of how to deal with the other materials discovered with the fragment B, and in general with the other Christian inscriptions from Grado, often discovered in contexts that are perfectly, like in the case, consistent in typology and function with their funerary character and with their relation to the 4th to 5th century, which are actually from Grado and which are from Aquileia, and how to distinguish one from the other. In any case, this reunion confirms that in an undetermined period, there were movements of materials from Grado to Aquileia, from Aquileia to Grado. And this is the last slide. Does fragmentary inscription, finally, does fragmentary inscription, know only throughout the manuscript edition, deserve a final mention? The manuscript have preserved the memory of some very important Christian monuments and epigraphs, now completely lost, which belong often to individuals of high rank, in one case even to a bishop, and which were characterized sometimes by metrical text. Alongside this better preserved and better known inscription, however, within the manuscript documentation is still possible to find unpublished fragments, but unfortunately, in this case, unless we trace them in the future, perhaps in some collection, it will be difficult to reconstruct further their content or verify their content where there are doubts, or find attacks to compare them with other pieces.